So I'm taking a break from cancelling people today. I think when you're the king of cancel culture, you kind of have to have a break and refocus your efforts on another worthy target. So we're taking a break from that today, but what we are talking about is George Carlin. Now, George Carlin, to many of you Americans, is like a pretty beloved comedian. And I want to talk about this a bit later, but to people like me from the UK, obviously, and a bit younger, I'm 25, George Carlin to me isn't really a comedian. He's just someone I have seen for years being shared in viral clips on social media. And his clips are often used by atheists, left-wing people, and as we're going to get into the video, also conservative people too, to make their political points. Now, lots of you will know George Carlin's comedy was primarily left-wing when it talked about politics. Like very, very left-wing, very, very scathing of Republicans, of right-wing Christians, of the powerful, of Wall Street, of the rich. It's actually very hard to think about who could think this guy is like pro-conservative. But we're going to get into why people think this. So how we're going to structure the video, I think, is we're going to talk about conservatives simping for George Carlin first, and then we're going to play the clip they absolutely love of him and why they seem to think he's on their side. And then we're going to go into a variety of topics and talk about not only if George Carlin was still alive, would he be on the left-wing side of nearly every issue, of how he would actually probably be cancelled by the right for his views on things like race, American history, and his basically campaigns against Republicans specifically. Even though he never really voted and he said both sides were terrible, he did often specifically really hard go after Republicans. I'm going to plug my social medias and Patreon for about a minute. If you're interested in supporting my work, please check this out. If not, skip. Timestamps are in the description. Before we get any further, a lot of my work on this channel is demonetized because when you're covering more serious, sometimes edgier topics, YouTube doesn't like this. So if you've ever enjoyed my work, please consider becoming a patron. And you don't have to pledge a crazy amount. I want to build up my Patreon based on as many people as possible pledging little amounts like $1 or $2. So if you feel like I have ever brought anything that's worthwhile into your life and my content, please really consider becoming a patron to help me continue to do this regardless of if YouTube monetize or not most of my videos in a given month. Also, if you want to join our communities, come check out our Discord and my subreddit. Those links in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, please check out the Kavernacle at Twitter, at Instagram, and also my personal Reddit where you can keep up to date with all my content and what I'm doing. Thanks so much for the support recently. We are slowly chugging along to 50k. We're almost there. Help me complete this lovely pyramid. For every 5k, we get a new chocolate orange, and 50k will just top that off. There was a live stream on a Tuesday and a Thursday, and all that stuff is archived on the Kavernacle Extra. If you want to know what I thought of Dune, because I finally saw it, and the politics of the movie, please go check out the channel. So to begin, when talking about George Carlin, people who love him that are quite prominent online are like Dave Rubin, Joe Rogan, and Tim Pool. Now, Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin are allegedly comedians too, so this is why they love George Carlin. Tim Pool is just a right-wing grifter who pretends he is on the left for some reason, or pretends he's a liberal. So let's first get into their comments about him. So here is Dave Rubin just before he speaks to George Carlin's daughter.
My guest this week is Kelly Carlin, daughter of the legendary comedian George Carlin. Kelly is an author and a speaker whose work connects many of the dots her father's life was all about. I've known Kelly for about 4 years now after connecting with her on Twitter because of how much I admired her dad. We've become great friends. Kelly has welcomed me into her world and the comedy community she's part of here in LA. I thought Kelly would be the perfect guest this week, not only because of her new book about growing up as a Carlin, but also because of all the issues her father's comedy was about that have become central themes of what we do here on this show. George Carlin was a relentless defender of free speech, using words and language to push the limits of what society found acceptable at the time. He railed against political correctness like no other comic before or anybody since. He dissected the absurdities of life that ultimately bring us together rather than rip us apart. I can't tell you how often I'm watching some campaign nonsense or some ridiculous politically correct crusade and think, man, I wish George Carlin was still alive to tackle this. The authoritarians that exist on both sides want control, and the best way to do that is to keep everyone hating on each other all the time. For all the things that Milo Yiannopoulos and I disagreed on, this is one spot we had total agreement. The rise of the cultural libertarians is here, and it contains people from all over the cultural map, from Chris Rock to Bill Maher, from Maajid Nawaz to Sam Harris. If George Carlin was still around, I think he would fit right in there, but would have also been sure to make fun of any group that would have accepted him as part of it.
Basically what Dave Rubin takes, and even the title of this video, he takes the free speech and the political correctness, which of course is stuff that the right pretend they care about, especially the free speech angle. The right have positioned themselves as defenders of free speech, while at the same time cracking down on free speech. And these free speech defenders like Dave Rubin have nothing to say about, I guess, the critical race theory hysteria, which is basically shutting down teachers from actually talking about racism. As we're going to see later, I don't think George Carlin would have supported this. But also here is Joe Rogan and Tim Pool also talking about George Carlin.
Yeah. It's a problem, you know, like when you're thinking and talking at the same time, there's a bunch of words bouncing around in your head and you're just trying to, and you think you're saying the right thing. When you're, you know, that's why intent is so critical.
George Carlin.
Yeah, and magic words are so fucking dangerous, you know, and that is what I'm going to tell you about later.
Oh, right on.
Yeah.
You know,
about a specific comedian that we know and love.
Well, George Carlin was absolutely amazing.
Well, he not only was he absolutely amazing, but people don't have to. You almost have to have lived during the time where he was getting arrested. Just much like Lenny Bruce before him, but to understand how significant he was when he was doing that 7 dirty words you can't say on television. Like back then, people were like, "What the f is this guy doing?"
But this for me, like I bring this up because it was kind of a formative moment where all of a sudden I realized, was my ideology predicated on assumptions?
Yes.
Like was I holding these views because other people told me to hold them?
Right.
Did I actually understand that there were some positive things on the other side? And then I slowly moved over to more of a center-left position.
Yeah.
And, you know, now the reason I bring this up is I watched that video. I tweeted the video of George Carlin, because, man, George Carlin was I used to watch his videos. My mom would put them on, and my mom's been a hippie, liberal, far left, all that stuff. And you'd probably consider a conservative by today's, you know, measures, the way things have been going. Now they look at, you know, Kevin Hart. He said a bad joke 10 years ago. Get him out. Like, could you imagine? God forbid, what would happen with George Carlin's routines today? They would be running all of his old routines, saying no, you have to ban him from the show.
Yes, right.
Why was it that George Carlin could go on stage and talk about how Republicans were dumb and how religion is crazy? He was clearly on the left his whole life, and he said these things that, by today's standards, would be considered conservative, right? And so for me, it's a weird thing to go from being on the far left as a young person. It was around like 19 or 20. I started to become more moderate. And then to see them today being extremely offended like people used to be in the 50s and 60s.
So this is a common sentiment you see online, is that what George Carlin used to say would be considered conservative. By today's standard, he'd be cancelled. We'd all hate him because the left are such sensitive babies. Now, I'm not saying George Carlin wasn't controversial. I'm not saying he didn't say a lot of stuff I disagree with. A lot of stuff that was, I guess, politically incorrect. Now, I think they referenced this video, but George Carlin was also arrested. He was for, I think, swearing in the 70s. For public indecency, I believe. But also, he made this video, and this is what these guys love about him and think, like, he represents, along with his you know, right-wing beliefs, apparently, now. So in this video, you can look this up online. I'm not going to show you what slurs he said, but I'm going to show you what he says after he's listed them. So he basically just lists like every slur for every like minority, and it's basically saying that like these words are not offensive in themselves. It's offensive when you have someone with intent using them.
There is absolutely nothing wrong. There is absolutely nothing wrong with any of those words in and of themselves. They're only words. It's the context that counts. It's the user. It's the intention behind the words that makes them good or bad. The words are completely neutral. The words are innocent. I get tired of people talking about bad words and bad language. It's the context that makes them good or bad. The context that makes them good or bad.
So I completely disagree with that, because the formation of these words comes from a place often of bigotry, and a lot of the time it's to demonize migrants or, you know, demonize people as the other. So he talks about slurs used for like the Vietnamese in the Vietnam War, the Japanese in World War II, talks about slurs used against the Irish, the Italians, just basically to other people. So I believe those words inherently are like gross and offensive. His point about like the intent behind them mattering, I don't think that really matters. Like, you don't have to say these words, and I get that he is like this free speech advocate. But yeah, something I don't agree with him on, something I understand why conservatives would like him for, but they've really taken him out of context completely. Because if you take what he said there, but then take his political beliefs, he would not be a conservative today. He would actually probably hate people like Tim Pool and Dave Rubin, and probably would hate what Joe Rogan has become in the last 2 years or so. But just to show you, these guys aren't alone, and plenty of conservatives love George Carlin. Here's the Ben Shapiro subreddit. Someone posted one of his speeches saying George Carlin was spot on about America here, unfortunately. Steve Crowder subreddit, George Carlin puts things in perspective. Another post, what opinions can you not have on YouTube? The anniversary of George Carlin's passing is on Saturday, which got me thinking of his famous words you can't say on TV list and bit. That got me wondering, what opinions can you not have on YouTube? So it's also being shared in the Republican subreddit. Tim Pool tweeting, we need George Carlin back. Dave Rubin saying, I think about it every day, tagging his daughter. Again, you're going to get a front row seat into how utterly ridiculous it is that these guys think George Carlin would have taken their side on nearly anything. On the conservative subreddit, George Carlin, we're so self-important, everybody's going to save something now. Save the trees, save the bees, save the whales, save those snails. And the greatest arrogance of all, save the planet. We don't even know how to take care of ourselves. Carlin's act is all about skewering sacred cows. No matter who owned them, he encouraged free thinking, not joining ideologies. Well, you're going to see what ideology he had. Mark Levin was playing this bit on his radio show last night. Carlin was a lefty, but he'd probably be appalled by today's left if he was still around. He absolutely hated political correctness and censorship. The left has been ruining comedy to the point that some comedians refuse to do shows at college campuses. Carlin wouldn't be happy about that. Another post, political correctness is America's newest form of intolerance because it comes disguised as tolerance. George Carlin and Joan Rivers were diamonds of their time that would be sexist or racist today. So first of all, a lot of conservatives have been backing Dave Chappelle because of his comments on trans people in his new Netflix special. Massive pushback, Netflix employees walked out, and a lot of people were sharing George Carlin clips being like, comedians say whatever they want, they push the boundaries, they don't care about political correctness, stop trying to cancel Dave Chappelle. But then other people were sharing this clip of George Carlin on Larry King talking about a recent comedian who was saying similar stuff to Dave Chappelle and saying why he doesn't like that, because as I agree with, good comedy shouldn't be punching down on marginalised people because it's not really funny and you're just making their lives worse.
I would defend to the death his right to do everything he does. The thing that I find unusual, and it's not a criticism so much, but his targets are underdogs. And comedy traditionally has picked on people in power, people who abuse their power. Women and gays and immigrants are kind of, to my way of thinking, underdogs. And, he ought to be careful because he's Jewish. And a lot of the people who want to pick on these kind of groups, the Jews are on that list a little further. You got women, gays, gypsies, blah, 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 and suddenly you find Jews. And Andrew,
suddenly Andrew's arrested.
Yeah, so, obviously he should do what he wants. And
why does he get away with it, do you think, then?
Well,
we have never laughed at jokes about the poor.
He's appealing. I think he's appealing largely. I think his core audience are young white males who are threatened by these groups. I think a lot of these guys aren't sure of their manhood because that's a problem when you're going in through adolescence. Am I really? Could I be? I hope I'm not one of them. And the women who assert themselves and are competent are a threat to these men, and so are immigrants in terms of jobs and the
so that's why we as an audience then will laugh.
You say we. I don't think you're.
No.
But I think you're
collective we.
I think that's what is at the core of that experience that takes place in these arenas. Is a certain, a sharing of anger and rage at these targets. And I'm sure Andrew isn't that angry at them. I'm sure he's playing it as a comic.
George Carlin woke? Oh my God. There he is, criticising straight white men and standing up for marginalised communities. I'm sure Dave Rubin and Tim Pool and all these conservatives would absolutely love him if he was around in 2021. But he obviously makes a great point there, and it's just funny, even from that clip alone, any conservatives think he would have both backed Dave Chappelle completely. He obviously probably would defend his right to say these things, but he wouldn't back what he's saying. He makes a good point as well, is like with Dave Chappelle, a lot of conservatives, white conservatives, are backing him up, but they also don't like African Americans the same way they don't like trans people. Now, since we're talking about like racism and race and bigotry and all these different things, George Carlin has been pretty outspoken on these things. Now, people like Tim Pool and Joe Rogan either fearmonger about critical race theory, or they platform people who do and agree with a lot of what they're saying. And to them, it's about making white people feel guilty for the founding of America. Obviously, what's happening is a massive attack on education, even teaching anything about racism. So I wonder what George Carlin himself had to say about the founding of the United States. I bet he said it was a great thing for democracy.
And of course, the country is founded on the double standard. That's our history. We were founded on a very basic double standard. This country was founded by slave owners who wanted to be free. Am I right? A group of slave owners who wanted to be free. So they killed a lot of white English people in order to continue owning their black African people, so they could wipe out the rest of the red Indian people and move west and steal the rest of the land from the brown Mexican people, giving them a place to take off and drop their nuclear weapons on the Japanese people. You know what the motto? You know what the motto of this country ought to be? You give us a color, we'll wipe it out. So anyway, about 80 years after the Constitution is ratified, 80 years later, the slaves are freed. Not so you'd really notice it, of course. Just sort of on paper. And that was, of course, during the Civil War. And it's a warlike country. Come on. I mean, forget foreign policy. Even the domestic rhetoric is warlike. Everything about our domestic policy invokes the thought of war.
So there you have George Carlin basically saying that racist white men in America who were slave owners fought a war to be free, basically so they could transfer economic power to themselves. Oh, it sounds like critical race theory. Better cancel George Carlin for that one. But again, does anyone think this guy is a conservative or would like conservatives? He says it in often like a non-PC way, but it often cuts through the noise. That's why I like him so much in these clips I'm showing you, is that he just doesn't care. He will just say it. And he was saying this stuff like 30, 40 years ago. It's not like something woke in 2021 or anything. But critical race theorists think you shouldn't learn anything bad about America. But here's George Carlin also talking about Japanese internment in the Second World War.
If you think you do have rights, one last assignment for you. Next time you're at the computer, get on the internet, go to Wikipedia. When you get to Wikipedia, in the search field for Wikipedia, I want you to type in Japanese Americans 1942, and you'll find out all about your precious rights, okay? All right. You know about it. You know about it. Yeah. In 1942, there were 110,000 Japanese American citizens and good standing, law-abiding people who were thrown into internment camps simply because their parents were born in the wrong country. That's all they did wrong. They had no right to a lawyer, no right to a fair trial, no right to a jury of their peers, no right to due process of any kind. The only right they had, right this way, into the internment camps. Just when these American citizens needed their rights the most, their government took them away. And rights aren't rights if someone can take them away. They're privileges. That's all we've ever had in this country is a bill of temporary privileges. And if you read the news even badly, you know that every year the list gets shorter and shorter and shorter. Government doesn't care about you or your children or your rights or your welfare or your safety. It's interested in its own power. That's the only thing, keeping it and expanding it wherever possible.
So there he's using it to make the point that rights in America are a privilege, and they're a privilege a lot of people don't have. And you can see that across America with how people are treated, with obviously white Christians having the most rights. And if you are from a poor marginalized community, of course your rights are going to be even less. And who stood up for the Japanese? Not many people. And even one of the most popular presidents of all time did this to them. Japanese Americans whose sons were also conscripted to go fight the Germans and Italians. So how's that for your civil liberties? Make your children fight in a war while putting you in an internment camp. Don't teach American children that. That's critical race theory. So 100% George Carlin would be making fun of Jordan Peterson. He would be making fun of Tim Pool, Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin. He would be making fun of the total hysteria about so-called critical race theory being taught to 5-year-old Americans. But George Carlin has also gone off on free speech before while criticising Ronald Reagan, the god to American conservatives.
Keep in mind, these Reagan people are the ones that were going to get government off our backs. Remember that? That was the rhetoric of the 1980 campaign. We'll get government off your backs and out of your lives. Yeah, but they still want to tell you what magazines you can read, and they still want to tell you what rock lyrics you can listen to, and they still want to force your kids to pray in school, and they still want to tell you what you can say on the radio. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, decided all by itself that radio and television were the only two parts of American life not protected by the free speech provisions of the First Amendment to the Constitution. The FCC, an appointed body, not elected, answerable only to the President, decided on its own that radio and television were the only two parts of American life not protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. And why did they decide that? Because they got a letter from a minister in Mississippi. A Reverend Donald Wildman in Mississippi heard something on the radio that he didn't like. Well, Reverend, did anyone ever tell you there are two knobs on the radio? But hey, Reverend, there are two knobs on the radio. One of them turns the radio off, and the other one changes the station. Imagine that, Reverend. You can actually change the station. It's called freedom of choice, and it's one of the principles this country was founded upon. Look it up in the library, Reverend, if you have any of them left when you finish burning all the books.
So there he is, basically making fun of the often libertarian rhetoric of Republicans in America, that you want to get government out of your lives, you want to be free, but here is our war against free speech. And it's the same stuff Republicans are doing in 2021, this time using critical race theory. It used to be more like religiously tinged back in George Carlin's day. But honestly, this guy, although is for free speech, thinks you can say what you want. That goes both ways. So he thinks you should be able to say all this stuff. It's not critical race theory. It's teaching people the truth about American society. So again, it blows my mind that conservatives would think this guy would be on their side just for one little stance on free speech, where it doesn't even really line up with their views on speech. Now, this clip of him and Bill Maher, I think in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina, is probably one of my favourite bits, because he's a bit older and he's just taking no nonsense from the other guy on the panel who asks him if he's Karl Marx. So, to give you an idea of how left-wing this guy is and what Republicans would perceive him as today, less than 20 years ago, someone was calling him Karl Marx, because in this clip, he both talks about how the wealthy in the country extract their wealth from the poor, which, you know, is true and I 100% agree with, also talks about how black people have it worse off in America, and finally, to sum it all up, calls George Bush a fascist.
It shouldn't be a surprise that rich white men don't care about poor black people, period. So they're not high on their list. They're not high on their list.
George,
they're not high.
George,
they're not.
that's
I don't
nonsense.
care if you love me or not.
That's
they're
nonsense.
not high on the conscious or the subconscious list of those people who are in charge of things in this country. The owners, forget these foolish elections. The owners of this country don't care about the poor in general.
The owners of this country. What are we going? What, is this Karl Marx talking to me? The owners of this country are the voters of this country.
You're wrong about that, my friend.
Aren't the owners of this country the voters in this country who elected George Bush?
No, they're not. Listen, politics, these elections are a charade. It is a charade.
Oh, okay.
It is, they are meant to, well, I'll tell you, listen, just listen for a minute. Learn a little something. The elections and politicians are in place in order to give Americans the illusion that they have freedom of choice. You don't really have choice in this country. The real looting in this country takes place in the transfer of the wealth from the poor to the rich. I'm sorry that you don't like class and the truth, my friend, but you're just stuck with it. Class and the poor have been systematically looted in this country. The rich have been made richer under this criminal, fascist president and his government.
I think do you know what fascism is? You know what fascism is?
To America,
you know what Nazis are?
No, wait, sir, wait, sir. When fascism comes to America, it will not be in brown and black shirts. It will not be with jack boots. It will be Nike sneakers and smiley shirts. Smiley. The fascism. Germany lost the Second World War. Fascism won it. Believe me.
I love that clip. Please send that to any conservative who likes him. This guy has always hated Republicans until, like, the day he died. And he has no problems of calling George Bush a fascist on mainstream TV. He has no problem talking about class, talking about wealth extraction, so much so someone calls him Karl Marx. Do you honestly think this guy would be on Tim Pool's side for anything? Would he be on Dave Rubin's side for anything? Jordan Peterson's side for anything? Would he be on any conservative side for any of this stuff? And of course, we already spoke about free speech. The right only care to pretend about free speech. It's the same in the UK. If you get like legit fired for criticising Israel and standing up for the Palestinians, no free speech warrior is coming to your aid. The same in America. If you want to ban people teaching Martin Luther King in schools, or teachers even talking about racism, no free speech warrior in America is going to come to your defense. George Carlin would come to your defense, because for all his faults and his views on this stuff, he does actually believe in free speech. So moving on to the last few clips I want to show. George Carlin, like I was showing in that last clip, does spread like class consciousness in his own little way. And I like the speech that he gives about how America like is basically bought and paid for. Like, you have no say. It's a reason why he never voted, because he was like, this country was bought and paid for a long, long time ago. Different flavors, sure, from the Democrats and the Republicans, but in essence, it's the same thing. Everyone in this country gets a bad deal because your wealth is basically looted from you. So let's have a look at this clip quick.
They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. You know something? They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table and figure out how badly they're getting by a system that threw them overboard 30 years ago. They don't want that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money. They want your retirement money. They want it back, so they can give it to their criminal friends on Wall Street. And you know something? They'll get it. They'll get it all from you sooner or later, because they own this place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club. And by the way, it's the same big club they used to beat you over the head with all day long, when they tell you what to believe. All day long, beating you over the head in their media, telling you what to believe, what to think, and what to buy. The table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged, and nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care. Good, honest, hard-working people, white collar, blue collar, doesn't matter what color shirt you have on. Good, honest, hard-working people continue. These are people of modest means. Continue to elect these rich guys who don't give a f***. They don't care about you at all, because the owners of this country know the truth. It's called the American dream, because you have to be asleep to believe it.
So to end with, that is one of George Carlin's more famous speeches, and it's a quote he is quoted for all the time. It's a big club, and you're not in it. But of course, just like pretty much anything, Animal Farm, 1984, loads of like left-wing movies or novels, conservatives just take a quote or something and take it out of context. So the big club and you aren't in it, to a lot of people, is some sort of like, you're not in the club of the left-wing conspiracy that is controlling the whole United States, represented by the communist Biden. I've seen conservatives unironically share this stuff. Now, what he was saying in that clip was, of course, like very good, and he's using his platform to just show people like how rigged the system is. And like I said, I don't think he's like perfect, but just the way he speaks is something everyone can understand, and he really gets through to it, and his anger is quite palpable as well. But it also just highlights the inequalities of the American system so nicely and so starkly. So those are those clips, and if you know anyone conservative who thinks George Carlin would have liked them, please send them this video. And to end, I guess I want to talk about my own feelings. Would George Carlin be cancelled by the modern, woke, soy latte drinking, avocado toast eating millennials or Gen Z? Now, I don't think he would have, because if he was alive today, I feel like he would have evolved enough, maybe had some thoughts about how his words may be hurtful, but even if he didn't, I feel like we would like him in like a begrudging way, in that his points are so good, even with his problematic side. I don't think the modern left, for all we're stereotyped to be, would push him away and be like, you've got to go to the Republican side because you're a free speech absolutist, while most of your politics are firmly left-wing and stuff we all believe in. But generally, I do think he would have been accepted. I do personally think he would have been evolved with being exposed more to, I guess, the struggles of various other minorities, for example, the trans community, who weren't as visible when he was alive and have become more visible in the last 13 years along with their struggle. But in terms of his general comedy, if I'm being honest, I don't find George Carlin's like straight up comedy that funny. I'm not really a fan of stand-up comedy just because of its scripted nature. And because of the audience reactions, I don't feel are always sincere, because you're like in this climate where you're like expected to laugh and kind of want to laugh. But I know like stand-up comedians need that energy to thrive on. And I've watched some of his other bits that aren't really political. And honestly, it comes across like he says stuff that is very shocking and he says it in a very eccentric way. I understand how that can be funny to people. I personally don't find it funny. But what I do love about him is his rhetoric style. Just like, you know, he talks like your average person, he cusses, he swears, and I feel like that just gets through a lot of the noise, because I always love someone who has such convictions and will just say them. Like, there's no, you know, beating around the bush, trying to both sides it. I'll go on mainstream TV and say this stuff about George Bush. I don't care. And I really like that about him. And I feel like that is why he resonates still today, even with people like me. You know, I'm not an American. I didn't grow up with this guy. The only thing I know him from, really, is viral social media clips of him talking about politics. But why they are timeless, despite being filmed often in the 70s, 80s, 90s, times before we were born, is because his message is so universal. And it's actually quite sad that not only have things not changed since he said all this stuff, they've actually gotten a lot worse. And if any conservative thinks he would love Donald Trump and the Republicans today, Donald Trump coming from this New York money, Donald Trump coming from like this Wall Street style like background, which George Carlin hated. George Carlin hated the American elite, hated American rich people. He would have absolutely despised Donald Trump, and he would despise modern conservative and modern centrist grifters like Joe Rogan and Tim Pool. And if he was around today, he would have comedy specials on Jordan Peterson and the hysteria around critical race theory. There are also other things I haven't spoken about. He was big on gun control as well, like not completely getting rid of guns, but big on regulating them. Loads of stuff about historic Republicans and how much he hates them. A lot of stuff about religious Americans, mainly conservative Americans. He was a massive, massive atheist. And wrongly, in my opinion, he said most of the world's problems are caused by religion, but he wasn't scared to even say that, even at the time where the religious right were really gaining a massive ground in America. You know, Ronald Reagan really unleashed them as a political force. But obviously, I do not know everything about George Carlin. I'm happy to admit that. So in the comments, please let me know, if you're an older American especially, I'm interested to hear what you think about George Carlin, like warts and all. What do you think his best quote is? What do you think his worst moment is, or something you really don't agree with him on? And then in the comments, let me know also what you think he would be making comedy specials on today if he was alive. But anyway, if you want to follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram, if you want to join our communities, my Discord and my subreddit is in the description. Also, if you want to support my work, please check out my Patreon. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.